was charged for a murder committed before I was born. By Hughra. It all started with a knock. Within seconds, I was on the floor with 2 police officers restraining me. As they stretched my hands behind my back and proceeded to read me my Miranda rights, I began to wonder what I had done. Thoughts began racing through my head. I wondered if I had been caught torrenting, or if I had accidentally hit something or someone with my car. None of those crimes seemed to correlate with the number of detectives searching my home. What could I have possibly done? After we had arrived at the police station, I would soon learn my fate. I was being charged with the 1984 murder of Sally McPherson. In 1984, a young girl born to immigrant parents, Sally McPherson, had been brutally murdered and assaulted in my neighborhood. The police had investigated the crime for some time before it went cold. That is, until the advancement in technology allowed them to thoroughly investigate the DNA. Being born shortly thereafter, in 1989, I had heard the rumors that had circulated the neighborhood as a child. Fear had always lingered throughout the vast majority of the individuals in the vicinity of the neighborhood. Was it a cult? Is there a serial killer living amongst us? Never could I have imagined that I would be at the center of the investigation. How could I, with the murder occurring years before I was born? DNA. Upon expressing my solid alibi of not being alive when the murder occurred, the police began to fabricate a story about how I had stolen someone else's identity and had been living a lie to protect myself. I had to be the murderer because the DNA found at the scene was a solid match to mine. I had fallen victim to a cold case without a suspect or motive because my DNA had matched. Nothing else seemed to matter to the detectives. They tried to coerce me into a confession. I was formally processed and remained in jail until yesterday, when my attorney was able to get me released on bail. My attorney, like myself, believed that I have a solid case. One cannot wonder enough how my DNA would end up at the scene of the murder before I was born. Since the day I was arrested, I have thought long and hard about the poor girl whose life ended in such misery. I feel for her parents, who expected nothing but prosperous opportunity when moving to the United States. Did they ever think that this could happen to their precious daughter? What would I do in their shoes? I have since questioned the legal system. How could it lead down a path so far-fetched that I am now being charged? I often wonder if there is a detective retiring that wants to close this case before he hangs up his badge. All of this is still to be learned. I have ignored the reporters that have lined the streets to my home. How would I address them? Would they believe me if I were to tell them? I couldn't have possibly committed this horrific crime. No one believes me. The last thing I want is to be featured on Dateline. I will leave it to my lawyer to determine how to proceed. But for now, I remain guilty until proven innocent in this corrupt legal system. Today, my lawyer has reached out to the DA and has informed me that they want to proceed with the case. They believe they have enough evidence to bring me to trial. This has me frightened beyond belief. What if I go to jail for this? I will continue to fight for my innocence and work to bring rest to this decades-old mystery. The Axeman of New Orleans by the Prowler. There was a killer that stalked our streets just a year ago. It frightened and shook our beautiful city of New Orleans to its core. The Axeman of New Orleans, they called him, and myself and other members of the Italian community were frightened to even go to bed at night. My name is Luigi Vespucci, and I was a detective during the Axeman's bloody spree. Now, while not all the attacks were against the Italian community, a majority of them were. We felt threatened. We felt hunted just because of where we came from and just because of who we were. I had just been promoted to detective days before the murders of Joseph and Catherine Maggio on the night of May 23rd, 1918. They had been found at their home on the corner of Upper Line and Magnolia Streets. They owned a grocery store and bar room. I knew these people. I frequented their establishment. The frightening thing of it all was I lived just 2 houses down from them. That crossed my mind as I was called to investigate the scene. As I entered that blood-splattered room, what if, I thought, what if this madman had decided to stop 2 houses down at my place instead of here? It would be me lying there on the bed with my throat slashed and head caved in with an axe. What he did to my friends was gruesome and barbaric, but sadly, besides finding a bloodied straight razor in the neighbor's front yard, which was used on both of the victims, and the killer's bloodied clothes that he changed out of after the murders, not much else was found. We questioned the brothers of Joseph, Jake, and Andrew, who found their bodies, and even detained Andrew, who shared the adjoining apartment next to the room of where the murders took place, of his brother and sister-in-law. He was a barber, and even though it was his razor that was used to slice their throats, we had to release him because there wasn't enough evidence to disprove his alibi. After the horrific murders of the Maggios, more and more attacks took place across our city, more murders and more injuries. Thankfully, some of the victims survived. From crime scene to crime scene, I was called upon to investigate. Bloody mess after bloody mess. Always the same M.O. Chisel a panel of the back door, a way to gain entry into the home. Slither his way inside and attack and bludgeon his unsuspecting victims in their beds with an axe. The attacks always transpired at night, and a bloodied axe was always found at the scene, with the victim or victims usually being of Italian descent. It was a horrifying and strenuous time for our community, and usually lively neighborhoods. But when the Axeman came, he changed all that. He officially claimed 6 members of our community, with his youngest victim being just 2 years of age, though there is believed to be more, and injured a further 6 individuals. The case finally came to a head and hit home for me on a personal level on the evening of September 10th, 1919. I was coming home late from work, trying to solve this damn case that consumed my entire being at that point. I was dog-tired. I barely managed to take off my jacket, and I collapsed into bed. I was then awakened in the middle of the night by a thud, and when I opened my eyes, I saw standing before me a shadowy individual. Before I could act, before even uttering a word, the shadowy figure leapt upon me with furious anger, hitting the side of my head with the blade of his axe. I felt lightheaded and instantly felt the warm gush of blood rushed down the right side of my face, then fell unconscious. When I came to, I was already being treated for my wounds and being questioned by my fellow detectives. Thankfully, my neighbor called for help after hearing the commotion. Like all the other crime scenes, a panel on my back door was removed, and a bloody axe was found in the backyard. Mine was one of the last attacks perpetrated by the Axeman of New Orleans. The bastard mysteriously disappeared just as quickly as he appeared, and the murders and attacks stopped. One of the last things the Axeman did was send a macabre letter to the newspapers that was published, asking for the citizens to play jazz music good and loud 15 minutes past midnight, and that every house that played their jazz music would be spared, but for those that did not, would receive a visit from him, and he would claim them as his next victim. The city of New Orleans was more alive than ever that night, and not a single soul was claimed. No one knows why he showed up in the first place. There's never been any motives, and no one has ever been caught for these horrendous crimes. He just disappeared one autumn night, but he's still out there, waiting. I know it. I feel it. I'm just lucky enough to be able to say that I survived the Axeman of New Orleans. This was a first-hand account of someone who survived the grisly rampage of the Axeman and experienced his carnage firsthand. Sadly, nothing has changed since the detective's reporting of his harrowing tale. No one was ever charged with these heinous acts, and the crimes remain unsolved. Who was this mysterious Axeman, and did he ever stop killing? The Cold Case of Martha. Author unknown. I've been wanting to tell this story for a while, but I never got the nerve to until now. Growing up, I had a childhood friend named Brian. Changed it for the sake of this post. Brian and I grew really close because we were, as he described, misfits. We never fit in with any of the other groups of people, and because of that, we had a great understanding of each other. During my freshman year of high school, I had history class with Brian. We had a project on creating our family tree. We each had to make our own, and Brian invited me over to his house to work on the project. Brian invited me to his house so I could help him on the design element. Brian was never really a good designer or an arts and crafts kind of guy. I would always help him design and put together his projects. One time, he was creating an animal cell for biology. He molded the different structures in the cell with clay and put it on a styrofoam ball. Everything fell apart, and from that point on, he asked me to help him design his projects. Anyways, I went to his house and he was working on gathering the information for his family tree. Lucky for him, his family was close-knit. They had a notebook that had every family member listed. The notebook was divided into two parts: people on Brian's mom's side and people on Brian's dad's side. Each family member had their own page and methods of contact. For some family members, there were notes about the individual. Brian let me scroll through the notebook, and there was one page that was really out of the ordinary. The page was dedicated to this girl named Martha. Martha's page was literally blank. Her name was at the top of the page, and that was it. I asked Brian about who Martha was. Brian stared at Martha's page for a long time. He looked at the page with a blank expression and looked frozen in thought. It took a good 5 minutes before he said, "I don't know. I really don't." He told me he would ask his parents when they have some spare time. Both his parents worked. He was home alone most of the time. I left Brian's house after helping him on his project, and this Martha girl scared the crap out of me. There was something off about this girl. She was the only person in the book with a blank page. She was on Brian's dad's side of the family and shared the same last name as Brian. Who is she, and why was her page blank? It took a month before Brian talked about Martha again. Brian told me his parents were just as confused as him. They contacted everyone that was listed in the notebook, and no one knew who Martha was. No one had one iota of info on Martha. Now, this was intriguing. I really wanted to know who Martha was. Brian told me that the page may have been set up as a prank. Deep down inside, I had a feeling it wasn't. Her page was there, so there has to be a reason behind the madness. Brian and I never talked about Martha again until the last day we met before going our separate ways for college. It was an ordinary day. We were going to go to the movies and the arcade to hang out. Brian brought up the Martha girl during lunch. I was surprised Brian brought it up because at this point it had been 3.5 years since her name was mentioned. Brian told that a couple of weeks ago he received a package from a person named Martha, and the return address was from an apartment complex in New York. He also mentioned that a map of New York and a set of keys were included in the package. Someone in Brian's family knew who Martha was. It was the only logical way, in my mind, for this situation to play out. Brian told me he put in a leave of absence for his upcoming quarter in college, and he would go to New York to investigate things for himself. He said his parents were very supportive of his decision and that he would text me during his trip. Brian did text me for the first 3 days. His trip he booked was 2 weeks. During his first 3 days, he would text me pictures of New York and the landmarks. He decided to do some sightseeing, and it didn't surprise me. Brian and I had never really explored anywhere past where we live. Both of us never visited any of the other states or traveled out of the country. This trip was something new for Brian, and he really wanted to make the most of it. However, on the 4th day, he stopped texting me. The 5th day was the same as the 4th day. I started texting him back, hoping he would answer back. I got no response. For the rest of the 2 weeks, Brian didn't respond to my texts. 2 weeks later, I received a rather large package. It was from Martha, and I flipped out. So many thoughts were running in my head. Who is this girl? How did she get my address? Hours passed by. I didn't want to open it, but something pushed me to. I regretted that decision. Inside this package was a rather large styrofoam box. Inside the styrofoam box was Brian's head. No rest for the innocent. Unknown author. All my relatives remember my father being a blast to be around. He was charming, charismatic, and was literally always there when someone needed him. He started off as a small-town police officer and worked his way up to detective in a few years' time. He had won awards and recognition for his community service and length of time in the force. His only real issue was his obsession with one particular case he was assigned. The Nancy Maynard case was a huge deal in my area. The teenage girl had disappeared on her way back home from school, and there hadn't been a single lead on her case since. My father was assigned the case and led the investigation. He did everything he possibly could to find out what happened to her, but all his effort was in vain. Everyone said he combed the scene of the crime almost daily, interviewed friends and family members for any hint of information, and had the Computer Crimes Division look over her online activity, but nothing was found. After a few weeks on the case, the media had moved on and the case went cold. The Maynard family and mine had become almost one family during this terrible time. They pleaded and begged my father to continue the search for their daughter. All their hopes and dreams were placed squarely on him. He promised to find her, even if it killed him. Even after his retirement, he worked on the case privately. He would close himself off in the basement for hours at a time, trying to conjure up a solid clue about the disappearance. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to keep his promise. He passed away before the case could be solved. Too much stress, too many fast food burgers, and not nearly enough exercise. His funeral was attended by many police officers, friends, and family, including the Maynards. They spoke of him as a living saint at the funeral. Without my father on the case, there was no one else to work it. The case was officially dead. After the funeral, my mother was too depressed to go through his belongings. She tasked me with the job of sorting out his belongings for donation, disposal, or storage. It wasn't much easier for me, to be honest, but at least I could spare my mother some of the pain she would feel. The basement was full of my father's old junk, clothing, furniture, and generally everything that he had ever owned was stored in that basement. It took a few days to clear out the junk. Couches, bedroom sets, and other assorted large items had taken up most of the basement, and they had already been tossed away. The only pieces of trash remaining were the mattresses leaning against the far wall of the basement. Moving the mattresses revealed a large metal door hidden behind them. The metal door was heavy and required all my weight to push it open. Dust fell off from the hinges, and it screeched loudly in protest when it finally allowed me to pass. My effort was rewarded with a set of dark stairs leading even further downward into the ground. It seemed like what I imagined a bomb shelter would look like. I came upon another metal door and struggled with it until it came open. That's when I stepped into the room and screamed. I can only confirm that the remains belong to Nancy Maynard. There's no exact way to tell how she died, but I know the remainder of her life hadn't been pleasant. There were videotapes of what my father did to her. The sick fuck forced her to watch herself being tortured and abused. He taunted her with videotapes of her parents living their lives after her disappearance. He told her how much her parents missed her and how he got off on their misery. That's only a fraction of the horror she experienced. There were diary entries with details about what he did. Why the hell did he feel the need to write them down? It was probably the cop in him, documenting everything that happens for the record. Everything Mr. and Mrs. Maynard said to him about Nancy was written in his journal. He showed her the case file with her own name on it, the news articles about her, and the poster with her name and picture on them. By the end of the whole ordeal, her spirit must have been broken. By the end of everything, my own spirit was broken. He'd used the interrogation techniques on her he learned on the job. Worst part was that he was planning to do it again once he was done with Nancy. If my father was still alive, I would have taken this to the police right away. Hell, I might have killed him myself. As far as I'm concerned, the man who I thought was my father was really a monster, hidden in plain sight. Someone depraved and sick to the core of his being that did this to a young girl in the house he lived in with his wife and son. But this isn't the case anymore. He's dead. If there is a hell, I hope he burns in it for the rest of eternity. As far as for the living, I have decided to keep this a secret. In some instances, ignorance is bliss. My mother would die if she found out about this, and she doesn't deserve it. My entire family would suffer the consequences of the depravity of a dead man. Nancy suffered more than any of us, except for the Maynards. The police are going to get an anonymous tip about the location of Nancy Maynard. Her remains in a shallow grave in the woods. I hope that at least I can give them some peace of mind. I know that I won't have any for the rest of my life. I was hired to edit a somewhat successful podcast, and the host, Mike, picked up something disturbing. A few years ago, a few of my friends and I decided to try our hand at podcasting. Everyone thinks that their group of friends are unique, and banter would translate to the mic. We were no different, and could not wait until we were raking in thousands of views. We even practiced how we would do ad reads when we were inevitably offered to do some. It didn't take us too long to figure out that no one really gave a shit about what we had to say about random topics in geek culture. There were already enough of that in the ether, and our inside jokes were funny to no one but ourselves. Needless to say, we lasted about 10 episodes before calling it quits. Even with our failed attempt at podcast glory, one good thing did come out of it. I was the editor of our group, and I actually had a knack for editing. We might not have been interesting to listen to, but the episodes were crisp, with no clipping, mouth noises, or dead air. I got fancy and threw in some music and transitions every now and then as well. With our show done, I decided to reach out to other podcasters and offer my services. It took a while, but eventually I was helping edit a few small-scale shows, and the pay was enough for a college student to not starve. About half a year into my new gig, I received an email from an up-and-coming true crime podcast. The show is called Cold Jane, and even with only a few episodes out, it was starting to gain popularity. Cold Jane was hosted by an unnamed narrator who never gave a hint to who he was. The air of mystery around who he was caused quite a stir, since the case he was covering on his show had gone cold for nearly 15 years. A woman named Jane Daniels had gone missing only to be found by workers at an ice factory. They were shoveling ice out of a large container that wasn't needed for a business event when one of their shovels made contact with her body. Everyone figured someone who worked for the plant killed her and wanted her to be found specifically at that event. Every single worker was questioned, but no firm suspects were ever brought forth. The unnamed host had been doing a lot of digging around and was bringing to light evidence that many did not know about. Some people even speculated that he was the killer, and this was a sick way for him to relive killing Jane. He shot down those accusations, but refused to reveal himself. When I got his email asking me if I'd be interested in editing future episodes of his show, I jumped at the chance. He was offering way more than I was making at the moment, and he promised to give me credit, so that way other creators might reach out to me. He mentioned that he would edit himself, but that he had some interviews coming up regarding the case and that he wouldn't have time to do everything himself anymore. The one thing he made very clear was that he would not reveal himself even to me. I didn't really care, as I just wanted to expand my resume and get paid. He sent me his latest unedited episode and told me to feel free to add music in, where I felt it was necessary. He trusted my judgment from my previous work, and that gave me a confidence boost to get right to work. I didn't realize how much work I'd actually have to do until I opened the file. His episodes were usually a little over an hour long, but this file was almost 2 hours. For someone who seemed to have an elegant voice, he sure did flub over his words a lot and had to do multiple takes of phrases. As I was going through, I noticed a section with little to no sound coming up that lasted about 5 minutes. He must have gone to the bathroom or took a water break. I was about to delete the entire section when a small bump of audio played, and I swore I could hear something. I backed up the track and played it again, but amplified the sound all the way. Sure enough, I could make out someone talking. I couldn't hear every single word, but I could make out some. Wait. Leave. Doesn't know. The words in between sounded like gibberish. For some reason, a chill ran down my spine. The voice was too low and far away to make out who it was, but something told me it wasn't the host. Pure silence played for about another 30 seconds. Then the voices started again, but this time I could hear more. If he mentions, we have to. Too long. Too hard for him to bring up old shit. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was listening to. Whoever was in the host's room clearly didn't want him snooping around the Cold Jane case. I kept listening, but had the episode sped up. I didn't care about fixing issues with the audio. I needed to know if the host was all right. Close to the end of the episode, the host dropped a name. It was the name of a local cop's son, and how he might know something. That's when I heard what sounded like a door bursting open from the audio. I don't know what happened, but the host knew he was in trouble and had to get this episode sent out. I heard him frantic right before the audio cut out. Google, save file, and send to docholiday25@gmail.com. The file went silent, and so did I. Did I just listen in on a potential murder? Those thoughts ran through my head before the sudden realization that he said my email address out loud. I was suddenly aware of how alone I was inside my school's library. He sent me this email around 10 p.m. last night, and now it's nearly been 24 hours. If whoever was there figured out who I was, then they could be here already. No, that's crazy. They couldn't get here that fast, right? And there's no way to know I'm in the library. The sweat on my neck felt hot and cold at the same time now. My chest was tight, and I was having a hard time breathing. I quickly packed up my things and made my way out of the cubicles and had my keys in hand to get in my car as quickly as possible. My car was one of 4 in the parking lot as I made my way near it. I clicked my unlock button, and it lit up the car parked in front of mine. I stood frozen as I noticed the license plate on the blue pickup truck. Louisiana, I whispered to myself. Every rational thought passed through my head about why a car from the same state the Cold Jane case was would be here on the East Coast. But I didn't even have time to comfort myself with those thoughts as the door opened and a burly-looking man walked out. He spoke with a flat voice that had a certain kind of southern charm to it. "Excuse me, son. We've got a long drive back, and we're hoping you'd maybe have a good podcast recommendation," he said with a smile as he approached me and reached in the back of his waistband. I would like to give a heartfelt thank you to the special friends of the channel for your overwhelming generosity. If you would like to support the channel, the link is below in the description. Also, please send me your stories and poems to duchessofdarkness27@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram at duchess.ofdarkness and Twitter at duchessofdarkn2. I want to thank all my listeners for your kindness, your encouragement, and your support. It means the world to me. Thank you for joining me. Until next time.